acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our hope. Amen. So first of all, I'm immediately going to apologize to anyone who is joining us from Bashaw, Daysland, or Killam this morning, because the scripture passage that will have been read to you in all likelihood is not the right one. What you should have heard was the second half of the very famous conversation that Nicodemus has with Jesus. Deanna talked about it a little bit in the Learning Together this morning, and that's the story that we're dealing with, but only the second half, and that's very important to remember. Very important to remember. Now, I'd also like to just begin by apologizing that if it feels a little bit this morning like you're being Bible studied, the journey will be worth it, I promise. We're going to go somewhere where hopefully the journey will take us to a point where it's a really good jumping off point for all of our journeys. Last week, Deanna talked about the Gospel of John and reminded us of some very important things to always take into consideration when you're reading the Gospel of John, and that's context, first and foremost. Not just the context of the story itself, but the context of the Gospel of John. It's important to remember that the Gospel of John is generally considered by most Bible scholars to have been written much later than the other Gospels. It's not the only thing that makes it unique, but truly the Gospel of John is unique. Not just in comparison to the other three Gospels that are in the Bible, but in comparison to all of the Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible. The ones that we're aware of that we no longer have, the ones that we're aware of because we keep finding them. John is still unique. And there's something really important to remember that makes the Gospel of John unique, and it's not just that it was written later. It's the context in which it was written, and Deanna talked about this last week. So, quick reminder, because it was written so much later, it was also written for a community, a small community of followers of Jesus who were struggling. They were struggling, first of all, because they had been hounded out of the synagogues by the other Jewish people in the community, and so they were on their own. The Romans didn't like them either. But also they were struggling because they were finding it hard to believe anymore. Not just because of those things, but because, Jesus said he'd be back, and he's not back yet. And everyone else is, they're believing other stuff, and we're still like, are we still working on this? So the author of the Gospel of John, I'm going to just call them John from now on, but truly we don't know who it is. We don't know if it was a man or a woman. We don't know if it was one person or many people. We're not really sure. The point is, though, that the gospel was written for a very specific context. It is written for people who needed encouragement and support. They needed hope. They needed to know that it was important to believe in Jesus. I said Jesus and nobody else. That's what's important. And if you remember some of the other passages that we've heard recently also from the Gospel of John, you know that it sounds very much like that. No one comes to the Father but through me. Okay, so clearly we should be a follower of Jesus and no one else. I'm going to come back to that in a second. There are other things about the Gospel of John that you need to take into consideration too, as well as that context piece, which is one of the other things that makes the Gospel of John unique is that John uses a lot of metaphors. A lot of metaphors. A lot. Not just light and darkness, which is very important, but word. Jesus is the Word, made flesh. John talks about, through all of these signs. Remember, again, last week, Deanna reminded us that it's not about miracles and it's not about teaching so much. It's about signs. And those signs are often metaphors for something else. They point to something. The way Jesus talks, the I am sayings, right? I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life. I am the way. Jesus never talks about himself that way in the other Gospels. So here's another way that the Gospel of John is unique. And here is still another way in which the Gospel of John is unique. None of the other Gospels corroborate anything that John says, with one exception. In other words, no one else tells the story the same way. And there are things in the Gospel of John that do not appear anywhere else. The fact that the Gospel was written later for a very specific context then should make you question whether or not Jesus actually said that. And indeed, if you are familiar with the Jesus Seminar, that is exactly what they said. The Jesus Seminar was a gathering of prominent biblical scholars from around the world. Not all of them, by the way. There were people who dissented and have very different opinions in the Jesus Seminar. But they got together and they famously voted with different colored beads. You may be familiar with that story if you're familiar with the Jesus Seminar. And what they were voting on was whether or not they thought Jesus absolutely would have said that, might have said it, or very definitely did not. And the beads were different colors. They were, I think, red, pink, and black. Red, gray, and black? Something like that. Anyway, the point is, there's no red in the Gospel of John. As far as the Jesus Seminar is concerned, there's nothing in the Gospel of John that they would say Jesus definitely said it that way. Guardedly, though, they'll say the author of the Gospel of John is clearly interpreting Jesus saying this elsewhere. But they're saying it their own way. Okay. But on top of that, there's also at least one instance where, because early versions of the Bible, of course, they didn't use quotation marks, we don't know where things that Jesus said might have ended. And the general consensus of biblical scholars is that in the conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus, Jesus himself stopped talking at verse 14. In other words, all of the things that came after it that we tend to attribute to Jesus were not Jesus at all, but the author of the Gospel of John interpreting Jesus for you. Is anybody annoyed yet? Because we don't want to hear that. We definitely don't want to hear that. We want to hear that the Word is the Word, especially the gospel that begins, the Word was made flesh, the Word from the beginning. Perhaps now is a good time for me to tell you that the Gospel of John is my favorite gospel. Because of all of that. Because someone took the time to look at all of the other stories that they knew and think about it and try and express it. To try and tell the story of Jesus in a way that connected with the people that they were standing in front of. And so the author of John writes this. Now, there are moments, of course, where you need to bear that in mind in a negative context, right? There are parts of the Gospel of John that are clearly anti-Semitic. But you understand why, right? Because of the audience he was writing for at the time. There are parts of the Gospel of John that might cause us to think, for example, Jesus is the only way. Because Jesus said, "No one comes to the Father but through me." But hang on for a second. Remember who John's writing for, first of all. Secondly, remember that whoever wrote the Gospel of John put some thought into it. Put some understanding of where they believed things were. This is one of the reasons why the Gospel of John is so important to me. The other Gospels tell a narrative. They tell a story, an important story. But the author of the Gospel of John goes right from the very beginning. Here's how we understand Jesus. The Word is made flesh. Divinity in the Gospel of John is very important. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is divine, but also flesh. Remember that part about the audience he's writing for? You're not that audience, are you? So when you listen to the Gospel of John, when you read the Gospel of John, and when I say listen, I'm not simply meaning someone read it to you. I mean listen and hear the Gospel of John and how it speaks to you, you hear it as you. And I think the message of the Gospel of John then becomes absolutely clear. When Jesus says, I am the way, Jesus means I'm the way. Not me, Jesus specifically, but this that I've been living for you. I've talked about this before. But here's a chance to talk about it in the context of Jesus talking to someone else. Jesus having a conversation with Nicodemus and trying to explain to Nicodemus what Jesus is all about. And you might remember how the story starts. He starts talking about the Spirit, and we have that famous sound bite that we often love to use, you must be born again. We all are, by the way, so if someone asks you, you already have been. He starts talking about the Spirit like the wind that goes where it will, and you don't know where it comes from, it just moves. It's energy, it's wind, it's movement, it's action. And then he tells this weird little story about Moses, which, if you're a first century Jew, you would have known by heart, of course. We're a little less familiar with it, but it's a story of when they were in the wilderness. The Jews were in the wilderness with Moses. And as you may recall, that one of the best parts of the Exodus story is how often the Jews complained about how things were going. And then God would do something through Moses in order to help them, and they'd all go, good job, Moses, not realizing it was actually God that was doing it. I'm just going to say that again because it's going to become really important in a second. They generally did not understand that it was God doing it. They thought it was Moses. So at some point, God decides, this weird little story, but God decides to send poisonous snakes amongst them. And St. Patrick was not there to lead them away. Does everyone know the story about St. Patrick and snakes? Right. So he wasn't. So anyway, the snakes were there, and they were biting the Jewish people. They were dying. And so they complained to Moses again, and Moses talks to God, and God says, here's what you do. Put a snake on a pole, hold it up, and if anyone looks at it and believes, they will be fine. So he does that. They look at the snake, they believe, they're fine. And so in this story of the conversation that Jesus had with Nicodemus, it appears that Jesus tells Nicodemus this story to remind him that there was a time when a symbol was held up in front of the people for them to believe. But it wasn't the symbol, it was God that was doing the work. It was the Spirit. And then, a couple of verses later, for God so loved the world. John 3:16. A verse that we love so much to take completely out of the context of this conversation that even Martin Luther said it was the gospel in miniature. It was a throwaway line in a conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus. I'm not saying it isn't important. It is. It's also in the part of the conversation that we're pretty sure was not Jesus speaking, but the author of the Gospel of John. That doesn't make it any less right. But it does make it simply a step on the journey. He goes on and talks about light and darkness and how evil is in the dark and good is in the light. Except it's not that precise. There's a lot of gray. And we know there's a lot of gray simply because of the context in which we're hearing that line. Nicodemus comes to talk to Jesus. Sure, he comes at night, but he comes to talk to Jesus. And here he is listening. He's paying attention. One of the things about metaphors, and John, the author of the Gospel of John, uses a lot of them. One of the things about metaphors is that they're inherently flawed, aren't they? Because they can make a point about a specific aspect of things, but the fact of the matter is they aren't the thing, they're simply like it. Which means there are going to be other aspects of this piece you're comparing it to that aren't the same. Because it isn't that, it's like it. And the thing about Jesus is that Jesus constantly says in the Gospel of John, I am this. Not that I'm like it, I am this. And so are you. Love one another the way I showed you. He will eventually say in the Gospel of John. My life has been the demonstration for you of the divine spirit that is in you and the humanity that is in you. The Word made flesh in me is the Word made flesh in you. Not like, it is. It's not a metaphor. It is. So through even this little piece of this conversation that Jesus has with Nicodemus, I don't for a moment see him saying to Nicodemus, it's me, I'm it, worship me. Nor do I think the author of the Gospel of John is saying that either. In fact, I'm not the first person to say this, and somebody famous said it, and I don't remember who. If Jesus were to arrive today, the first thing that would annoy him the most is worshiping Jesus. Because it's not Jesus. It's the way. It's not Jesus, it's the light. Jesus is one of the ways in which we come to God. The way that for us demonstrates God alive in us. The one that shows us what is, not what we're like, but what is at the heart of things for us. So I think through this entire conversation, that's what's happening. Whether Jesus said it or the author of John said it, it sure sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? Which ought to be the lens by which we read Scripture. Not the accuracy of the words, but what's at the heart. Isn't that one of the teachings of Jesus? What's at the heart? And what's at the heart of this conversation with Nicodemus is, it's not me, this person. It's what is alive in me, the spirit that is alive in me, the spirit which Nicodemus would have understood as being from above, the spirit that moves in like the wind in a way that we can't see, and we don't know where it comes from. We don't even know where it goes to, but we know it's alive. The spirit of life that is alive in the sign that was shown to the Jews in the desert in Exodus, the sign that is shown to us in Jesus. The light, the way, the bread of life, the vine, all of those images that we know from the Gospel of John. They are images to show us what is at the heart of things, which is God. By whatever way we come to God, that is our journey. Jesus shows us what is the source of that journey, what is with us on that journey, what is where that journey takes us. To me, that is one of the great values of the Gospel of John. The author of the Gospel of John knew the narrative. He knew sources. He knew things. She knew things. The book is full of wisdom in this way. And by the way, as you no doubt recognized from the first hymn we sang today, wisdom traditionally in history has been a woman. So it's not even a gender issue. It's just not. It's spirit. It's what is at the heart of each of us that is our journey in life and to God, with God. That's what this story is about. That's what the Gospel of John is about. That's what Jesus is about.